When did you begin the poetry?
I started very young, at 6 years old, when I learned to write and read in school. In the beginning it was hard for me to read and write, but once I learned, I had the need to make up my own words and not have others giving me words. So I made up like children's poems. They were a bit childish maybe, but I never stopped since then. And I started to publish 20-something years ago.
And the authors that you marked, you inspired?
First of all, I'm not sure if I'm necessarily inspired by them. I love to read, but I think inspiration, it's something that is hard to track really. And you know, being here on this beautiful street with you might inspire me more than reading good literature. I do like Hebrew poetry, some names that you wouldn't know, like Nurit Zarchi, Yehuda Amichai, Agi Mishol, some of the greatest Hebrew poets. And Neruda, I like. This maybe is more known for international audience. Of course, Sylvia Plath. But I'm most connected to, I think, to Hebrew poets when it comes to poetry and not prose. Though I like prose as well, like Toni Morrison and some others. I'm not sure I distinguish between poetry and prose when it comes to inspiration.
When did you publish your first poem and first book?
My first poem was in my first book. I didn't publish anything, and my book was the first poetry I ever published. After writing since 6 years old, I had a crisis in my life, and then I realized that even though I studied art, I studied cinema, I studied art therapy, I worked as a journalist and I was writing as a journalist, I realized that I have to write and then I have to publish. So it was, I think, in 1999, if I remember, my first book. But before, I'd never published a poem. I sent it to a publisher and he took it. The book was titled Contact Glue. It has double meaning, the contact, but it glues, and that was it.
How you are writing your poems?
I don't think there is one way to write a poem, but sometimes it's as if I'm trying not to write. Maybe because it finds me in my vulnerable place, or I think that if you try to catch inspiration, it's going to run away from you. So sometimes on travel or on the bus or when I walk or take a shower, but usually I just carry a notebook, and for the first draft, whenever it happens, I'm ready, and only when I work on the poem and do editings or compile a manuscript, then I sit, in my room and work more on the poem. But for the first idea, it needs to come to me. I cannot come to the poem needs to come to me.
Mm-hmm. What are you thinking about the actual Israeli poetry?
These years it's been reduced to prose often, or to personal blogs and journals. I think Hebrew is a very unique language because it's biblical. Each word can have several meanings, and in poetry it can layer your poem very easily. And also Hebrew has a female or male form for every word, so it's very easy to personify objects, which is very useful for poetry. For instance, my French book is called Soleil Hésitant, in my poem about it. The sun, my Hebrew poem, the sun is a female representing me and my daughter, and the moon is a male figure representing my husband. And I think Hebrew is very rich, but you can find it more in earlier Hebrew poem, not so much these days.
What are you thinking about the translation?
I do translation myself. I think it's important, even politically speaking, to bring different voices. And there's something interesting or funny about poetry translation, because poetry is all about the language, and yet you can translate and still recreate the poem in a different language and hold its essence. So personally, I appreciate translation, but I think the translation needs to be a creation on its own, at least for poetry, if we want it to work. And of course, the translator need to be very immersed in the culture of the original language, not just the language.
Is poetry a need for the others?
I believe so. I think it's true that sometimes it's more important for the poet than for the readers. But you know, as poets, we don't often meet our readers, but when I come and read and I see people are touched, and sometimes when they understand that they don't need to know about poetry to be touched by it, it reminds me that it is a need. I believe it is. כל המאורות. אני נטענת מאנרגיה סולארית, אבל עכשיו יש לי אותך ואת הילדה. אני מוכרחה למשוך את כולכם החוצה על גבי, רק כדי שאוכל להיטען. והילדה היא שמש קטנה, אני שמש מעט יותר גדולה, ואתה הירח. אלו כל המאורות. אין מלבדם אלא חשיכה. אני צריכה לחצוב דרכי החוצה מבעד למחשכי הבית, מבוכי הכביסה, מפלי החלב והבכי, להיטען מאנרגיה סולארית שתחדור אותי, תעבור לילדה, אולם לא תכרוך אותך. אלו כל המאורות, אין מלבדנו אלא חשיכה. The promised wasteland. I'm pulling you out of the water as if out of your own sorrow. We don't trust being saved is worthwhile, even before we know it will take you away from water for most of your life. The second time you encounter it, you'll have to break the water. The desert is wide, wild, wasted Moses, a landscape so widely open that it's inaccessible. No nooks for haven of rest, for hiding, for intimacy. The embrace of courageous, swarthy dunes is abrasive. If sand gets in your eyes, you tear. Their tongue brings the opposite of saturation and penetrate determinedly the land that already had so little to offer. This is when you realize promises better kept unfulfilled, and you do not enter.